The funeral hall was silent when Mark Johnson walked in, his hand resting on the belly of another woman. Ashley Miller was visibly pregnant. He did not lower his head. He did not let go of her hand. Emily Johnson stood by her father's casket dressed in black, her expression unreadable. Guests turned. Whispers spread. Some assumed she was powerless. Others assumed she had already lost everything. No one there knew that the will had already been executed. No one knew the accounts had already been sealed. And no one, not even the man humiliating her in front of her father's memory, understood that this moment was not the beginning of her fall, but the final proof of his. If you believe dignity should never be mistaken for weakness, stay with this story until the end. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if quiet strength and legal justice matter to you, consider subscribing so stories like this are never told without truth. Emily Johnson had learned long before her marriage began to fracture that silence unsettled people more than anger ever could. She was not a woman who filled rooms with her presence. She did not dominate conversations or announce her opinions. At dinners, she listened. At gatherings, she observed. When others spoke too much, she remembered what they revealed without realizing it. That habit, quiet, patient, meticulous, had been shaped long before Mark Johnson entered her life. Emily grew up in a household where restraint was a form of discipline. Her father, Robert Whitman, believed that excess invited attention, and attention invited distortion. He lived in a modest home despite the resources at his disposal. He wore the same watch for decades. He disliked large celebrations, loud restaurants, and unnecessary explanations. From him, Emily learned that power did not need witnesses to exist. Mark had never understood that. When they met, he was drawn to what he interpreted as humility. Emily did not talk about her family. She never spoke about money. She worked steadily, contributed quietly, and never corrected people when they made assumptions about her background. To Mark, that silence translated easily into something more convenient, insignificance. Their marriage, at least on the surface, appeared unremarkable. A small ceremony, a practical apartment, shared routines that looked like stability. Mark worked in mid-level management, always chasing the next promotion, the next signal that he was moving forward. Emily supported him without interference. She remembered dates. She handled logistics. She never questioned his late nights or sudden trips, not at first. It wasn't that Emily failed to notice the changes. It was that she chose not to respond to them prematurely. The first signs were small. A phone angled away from her at the dinner table, a new password, a sudden insistence on privacy where there had once been none. Mark began speaking about ambition with a sharpened edge, as if the word justified a growing impatience with the life he shared with his wife. Emily noticed everything. She always had. She began to keep records not with suspicion, but with precision. Emails were archived. Calendar entries were duplicated. Financial statements were reviewed and filed, not because she expected betrayal, but because disorder made her uncomfortable. It was a habit formed from watching her father prepare for contingencies others refused to imagine. Robert Whitman never warned Emily directly about Mark. He did not need to. Instead, he asked questions, casual ones. Questions about how Mark spoke when he was frustrated, about how he handled disappointment, about whether he respected boundaries when no one was watching. Emily answered honestly without embellishment. Robert listened. And then he began making arrangements. Mark, meanwhile, had his own narrative firmly in place. He saw himself as the engine of their marriage, the one whose career trajectory defined their future. Emily to him was supportive but replaceable. Her restraint became evidence in his mind that she lacked leverage. He spoke openly, too openly, to colleagues about wanting more. More recognition, more admiration, more excitement than the quiet woman waiting at home seemed capable of providing. Emily heard fragments of these comments later through others. She did not confront him. Confrontation required emotional energy she preferred to reserve. Instead, she watched as Mark's dissatisfaction matured into entitlement. When Robert fell ill, the distance between husband and wife became unmistakable. Mark attended the first hospital visit, then gradually found reasons not to return. Work deadlines, travel, fatigue. Emily stopped asking him to come. She handled appointments, medications, paperwork, and conversations with doctors alone. During those months, Emily spent long evenings at her father's bedside. They spoke little. Robert was not a man who wasted words, especially at the end. But he asked her one question repeatedly, as if measuring the consistency of her answer. "Are you prepared to be independent?" he asked. Emily never hesitated. She never answered emotionally. She simply said yes. What Mark did not know, what he never thought to ask, was that Robert Whitman had already engaged Daniel Brooks, a lawyer who had represented him for decades. Their meetings were quiet, methodical, and deliberately invisible. Robert did not announce his intentions. He did not threaten. He structured. By the time Mark began openly staying out overnight, the legal framework was already forming. Emily knew this, though she did not know every detail. She trusted her father's judgment. She trusted the process. And more than anything, she trusted her own restraint. When Robert died, Mark expressed performative grief. He spoke of loss in broad terms, avoiding specifics. He referred to Robert as a simple man, a phrase that lingered unpleasantly in Emily's mind. She corrected him once gently. Mark laughed it off. He did not attend the planning meetings for the funeral. He did not ask about the guest list. He did not concern himself with logistics. Emily handled everything with the same calm efficiency she applied to all necessary endings. It was during this time that Mark made his most consequential assumption. He believed that the funeral would mark a transition not for Emily, but for himself. He believed that her father's death closed the final door on any hidden influence. Whatever Emily had been protected by, he assumed was gone. What remained was a woman he could finally step away from without consequence. So when he decided to bring Ashley Miller to the funeral, he did not consider it cruelty. He considered it honesty. Emily learned of his intention the night before. He did not phrase it as a discussion. He informed her casually that he would not be attending alone. His tone suggested inevitability, not remorse. Emily did not argue. She did not cry. She simply nodded. Later that night alone, she reviewed the documents her father had ensured she possessed. She read them carefully, not because she needed reassurance, but because understanding gave her peace. The numbers were staggering. The structure was precise. The protections were absolute. And still she slept. By the time morning came, Emily Johnson was no longer simply a grieving daughter or a disregarded wife. She was a woman standing at the edge of a moment that would reveal with unforgiving clarity who had misunderstood her all along. Mark Johnson had always believed that success was something other people noticed before you did. He watched for it in how colleagues reacted when he entered a room, and how long pauses lingered after he spoke, and whether his name surfaced during meetings he wasn't invited to attend. He measured his worth by external markers, job titles, salaries, admiration. And when those markers lagged behind his expectations, frustration settled in like a permanent condition. Emily never challenged that worldview. She never tried to correct it. And because she didn't resist, Mark assumed she agreed. In the early years of their marriage, he told himself he was fortunate. Emily was dependable. She did not compete with him for attention. She didn't ask invasive questions. She seemed content to build a life quietly alongside his ambitions. To Mark, that arrangement felt balanced until it didn't. As his career plateaued, he began to look at his marriage differently. What once felt supportive now felt static. Emily's silence, which had initially appealed to him, started to irritate him. She did not validate his grievances loudly enough. She did not mirror his resentment when promotions passed him by. She did not inflate his self-image when he felt diminished. Instead, she listened. And Mark mistook that listening for indifference. The affair did not begin dramatically. There was no sudden passion, no moral collapse Mark was willing to acknowledge. It began with conversation complaints shared with someone who laughed at the right moments and agreed too easily. Ashley Miller was younger, more responsive, and impressed by details Emily never commented on. She asked questions that made Mark feel important. She praised ambitions that Emily treated as ordinary responsibilities. Mark told himself that he deserved that attention. He rationalized the affair with language that excused him from accountability. He said his marriage lacked spark. He said Emily was emotionally distant. He said he had tried, even when he hadn't. Each justification built on the last, until betrayal no longer felt like a choice, but an inevitability. Emily noticed the shift long before Mark stopped pretending to hide it. She noticed the change in cadence, how Mark spoke more quickly when she asked simple questions, how irritation surfaced where neutrality used to exist. She noticed the absence of small courtesies, the way he no longer waited for her, before eating, the way his phone never left his sight. She did not confront him. Confrontation, she understood, only encouraged people like Mark to rehearse their lies. Instead, she began observing with greater focus. Mark grew careless as his confidence grew. He stopped deleting messages immediately. He began leaving financial traces that suggested parallel routines. Emily did not react to any of it. She archived, she categorized. She stored information the way others stored emotional grievances. In Mark's mind, Emily's lack of reaction confirmed his assumptions. He interpreted her calm as resignation. He began speaking about her dismissively to Ashley, framing himself as a man trapped by obligation rather than bound by choice. He never considered that Emily might be choosing something else entirely. When Robert Whitman's illness worsened, Mark viewed it less as a family crisis and more as an inconvenience. Hospital visits disrupted his schedule. Conversations with doctors bored him. He offered sympathy in phrases that sounded rehearsed. Emily accepted them without comment. What Mark did not notice was how carefully Emily watched his absences. She observed which nights he failed to call. She noticed how his explanations grew thinner, less precise. She took note of the way he spoke about her father, not cruelly, but dismissively. He lived simply, Mark said once, as if simplicity were a flaw. I don't think there's much to deal with. Emily did not correct him. Robert, lying in a hospital bed, did not ask about Mark's fidelity. He did not need to. He asked Emily whether Mark showed up when things were difficult, whether he respected her when she had nothing to offer him emotionally. Emily answered honestly. Robert listened carefully. Mark's resentment reached its peak after Robert's death. He believed that whatever restraint Emily's father had represented, whatever subtle authority he imagined existed, had disappeared. In his mind, the funeral was not a moment of mourning, but a closing chapter. With Robert gone, Mark felt unobserved. That sense of freedom emboldened him. He stopped pretending his affair was temporary. He began speaking openly about Ashley in ways that suggested inevitability rather than discretion. He did not ask Emily how she felt. He assumed her feelings were irrelevant. When he told her he would bring Ashley to the funeral, he expected resistance. He expected tears, anger, negotiation. He was prepared to frame her reaction as hysterical, unreasonable further evidence that the marriage had failed. Instead, Emily said nothing. She looked at him, steadily nodded once, and returned to what she was doing. That moment unsettled him more than any argument could have. But Mark dismissed the discomfort quickly. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself Emily's silence was proof that she understood her position. He did not realize that what he interpreted as acceptance was in fact assessment. By the time Mark walked into the funeral holding Ashley's hand, he believed the narrative was entirely under his control. He believed he had outgrown his marriage. He believed Emily lacked the means or the courage to respond. What he failed to understand was that Emily had never been competing with him. She had been documenting him. Every careless word, every dismissive gesture, every assumption he made about her ignorance. He offered them freely, unaware that they were shaping a record far more permanent than his self-image. In the quiet that followed his arrogance, the consequences were already aligning themselves methodically, legally, and without emotion. Emily did not need to speak. Mark was doing all the revealing for her. Robert Whitman's illness arrived without drama the way permanent things often do. At first, it was fatigue and exhaustion that lingered longer than it should have. Then came missed appointments, unexplained weight loss moments, when his focus drifted mid-conversation. Robert did not complain. He adjusted. He simplified his days, reduced his movements, and quietly began closing loops only he knew existed. Emily noticed immediately. She accompanied him to the hospital, sat beside him through tests and scans, and listened as doctors spoke in careful language meant to soften reality. She asked precise questions. She wrote things down. When prognosis replaced possibility, she did not argue with it. She prepared. Mark came to the first appointment. He sat stiffly in the chair across from the physician, arms folded, eyes flicking toward his phone whenever the explanation extended beyond a few sentences. He asked one question, whether the condition was manageable, and seemed relieved when the answer was not immediately catastrophic. After that, his visits became sporadic. Work, he said, was demanding. Travel, he said, was unavoidable. Emily never challenged those explanations. She simply noted the pattern. Mark was present when appearances mattered and absent when endurance was required. Robert noticed too, though he never mentioned it. During the weeks that followed, Emily took on responsibilities that went beyond caregiving. She handled insurance calls, coordinated treatments, and organized paperwork that Mark never asked to see. At night, she returned home alone, cooked quietly, and reviewed documents her father had asked her to locate. Old files, account statements, legal correspondence stored neatly in boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Robert Whitman had always believed in preparation. He believed that clarity was an act of kindness, even if it arrived too late to be appreciated. It was during this time that Daniel Brooks re-entered their lives, not as a sudden presence, but as a continuation of a relationship that had existed long before Emily was married. Daniel did not visit the hospital. He met Robert privately, discreetly, and always left without fanfare. Emily was aware of these meetings, though she was not present for them. She did not ask for details. Her father would share what mattered when the time was right. Mark, on the other hand, was entirely unaware. He did not notice Daniel's name on correspondence. He did not inquire about Robert's affairs. He assumed without evidence that there was little to address. Robert's modest lifestyle reinforced Mark's confidence. He mistook restraint for limitation. When Mark did visit the hospital again, weeks later, it was brief. He brought flowers that were placed on a side table and forgotten. He offered reassurances that sounded generic. Robert thanked him politely. The conversation did not linger. Afterward, Mark complained to Emily about the inconvenience, about the parking, about how depressing hospitals were. Emily listened. She always did. That night, she sat beside her father's bed, while the monitors hummed softly in the background. Robert looked thinner, his movements slower, but his eyes were clear. "People reveal themselves under strain," he said quietly. "It's not cruelty, it's gravity." Emily nodded. She understood what he was telling her, not as instruction, but as confirmation. Robert spoke to her then about independence, not in abstract terms, but practically. He asked whether she understood the difference between ownership and control, whether she knew how to protect something without displaying it, whether she trusted systems more than emotions, when emotions proved unreliable. Emily answered each question calmly. "Yes," she said, "I understand." In the weeks that followed, Robert's condition deteriorated steadily. Mark stopped visiting altogether. He sent messages instead, short, obligatory, easily forwarded. Emily did not share them with her father. She did, however, save them. Robert never asked why Mark wasn't there. He did not need explanations. His focus had shifted entirely to ensuring that Emily would not have to rely on anyone's goodwill once he was gone. Daniel Brooks finalized documents during those final weeks. Trust structures were reviewed. Beneficiary designations were confirmed. Safeguards were layered carefully, each clause, anticipating a possibility others would dismiss as improbable. Robert knew better. He had seen how people behaved when they believed themselves entitled. He had seen how relationships changed when money became visible. He had chosen discretion not out of fear, but out of strategy. Mark's absence made the process easier. On the morning Robert Whitman died, Emily was with him. The room was quiet. There were no dramatic last words. He simply looked at her and said, "You'll be all right." Emily believed him. Mark arrived hours later, already aware of the outcome. He embraced Emily's stiffly offered condolences that sounded performative and immediately asked practical questions about arrangements, about timelines, about what needed to be done. Emily answered without detail. Over the next few days, she organized the funeral alone. Mark delegated. He offered opinions without taking responsibility. When Emily told him the date, the location, and the format, he nodded absently. What about after he asked once? Things. Emily looked at him steadily. "Everything is being handled," she said. He accepted that answer without suspicion. As the funeral approached, Mark's confidence grew. He began speaking more openly about changes he intended to make in his life. He spoke as if the future were already reorganizing itself around his preferences. Emily did not interrupt. By the time Robert Whitman was laid to rest, every document had been executed. Every safeguard had been confirmed. Every assumption Mark made rested on ignorance he had never thought to correct. The illness had done its work not only on Robert's body, but on the illusion Mark had constructed about his own position. What remained was not chaos, but structure. And Emily stood at its center, composed, observant, and fully prepared for what would follow. The days following Robert Whitman's death unfolded with a quiet efficiency that surprised those who knew Emily only superficially. She moved through tasks without visible strain. Death certificates were requested, clergy were contacted, seating arrangements were planned with the same calm precision she brought to everything that mattered. She did not dramatize her grief, nor did she conceal it. It existed in a contained, private way, something she carried internally without display. Mark Johnson interpreted her composure as detachment. He watched her from a distance, uncertain how to respond to a wife who neither collapsed nor demanded comfort. He had expected tears. He had expected accusations, perhaps even a plea for reassurance that he was still present, still committed. Instead, Emily operated independently, consulting professionals, making decisions and closing conversations before they could drift into sentimentality. Mark found that unsettling. He compensated by asserting himself in the only way he knew how, by narrating his intentions. Over dinner, he spoke about changes, about how life was too short for compromise, about how honesty, even when painful, was better than pretense. He spoke as if Emily were an audience rather than a participant. Emily listened as always. It was on the third evening after Robert's passing that Mark mentioned the funeral explicitly. He did not frame it as a discussion. He stated it as a fact. "I won't be coming alone," he said, glancing at his phone as he spoke. "I think it's better this way. No secrets." Emily paused just long enough to acknowledge the weight of the statement. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said. Mark looked up surprised. He had prepared himself for resistance. He had rehearsed arguments about transparency, about moving on, about refusing to live dishonestly. Emily's acceptance disrupted that script. "You understand," he said, sounding relieved. Emily did not correct him. Later that night, she sat alone at the dining table, surrounded by folders her father had insisted she keep close. She reviewed them carefully, not for reassurance, but for clarity. The trust documentation was thorough. The legal language was exact. Every scenario that could reasonably arise had been anticipated and addressed. She noticed again what Robert had taken such care to do. Nothing was left to interpretation. Mark, in contrast, operated almost entirely on assumptions. In the days leading up to the funeral, he became increasingly confident. He spoke to Ashley Miller openly on the phone, no longer concerned about privacy. He discussed logistics with her, what she would wear when they would arrive, where they would sit. He framed the event not as a solemn farewell, but as a declaration, Ashley listened with a mixture of excitement and unease. She had never attended a funeral under such circumstances. She asked Mark whether it was appropriate. He dismissed her concerns easily. "Emily knows," he said. "She's accepted it." Ashley wanted to believe him. Emily never addressed Ashley directly. She did not acknowledge her existence beyond what was unavoidable. This omission, too, Mark misinterpreted. He took it as further evidence that Emily lacked the will to confront reality. What he failed to notice was how deliberately Emily separated emotion from action. On the morning of the funeral, Emily dressed alone. She chose black not as a symbol, but as a formality. Her movements were unhurried, her expression neutral. She reviewed the schedule one final time, confirmed transportation, and arrived early. She stood near her father's casket, greeting guests with quiet gratitude. People spoke to her softly, cautiously unsure how to address a woman who appeared so composed in the face of loss. Emily thanked them, without elaboration. Mark arrived late. The moment he entered the hall, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Ashley's pregnancy was unmistakable, her presence impossible to contextualize politely. Mark did not hesitate. He walked forward, his hand resting on Ashley's abdomen, his posture deliberate. Emily saw them immediately. She did not move. She did not react. Guests whispered. Some looked away. Others watched closely, curious to see whether Emily would respond. Mark scanned the room, gauging reactions, measuring his own impact. When his eyes met Emily's, he expected anger. Instead, he saw something else entirely distant. Not emotional distance, but evaluative distance. The look of someone registering a fact rather than absorbing a wound. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his presence, and then turned back to the guests she had been speaking with. That moment unsettled Mark more than any confrontation could have. Ashley sensed the tension immediately. She tightened her grip on Mark's arm, her confidence wavering. She had expected hostility, perhaps even humiliation. What she encountered instead was indifference, a kind that made her suddenly unsure of her role. As the service began, Mark and Ashley took seats without waiting for instruction. Their choice was conspicuous. Murmurs rippled through the room. Emily remained standing near the front, listening to the eulogies with quiet attention. She did not look back. The ceremony unfolded with restraint. Robert Whitman's life was described in measured terms, his discipline, his values, his refusal to confuse visibility with substance. Emily listened carefully. Each word felt deliberate, as if chosen to withstand time. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected the funeral to mark a turning point, a public acknowledgement that his marriage was ending, that he was stepping into something new. Instead, he felt peripheral, disconnected from the gravity of the moment. When the service concluded, guests approached Emily one by one. They offered condolences. Some hesitated, clearly aware of the situation unfolding nearby. Emily thanked them without addressing the spectacle. Mark waited. He expected Emily to confront him once the crowd thinned. He anticipated anger accusations, perhaps even desperation. What he received instead was silence. Emily left the hall without speaking to him. Later that evening, alone again, Emily reflected on the day, not with pain, but with clarity. The funeral had confirmed what she already knew. Mark's behavior was not impulsive. It was deliberate. He had chosen a public sacred space to assert dominance. He had mistaken restraint for permission. What he did not understand was that the funeral was not a stage for his declaration. It was a final measure, a moment that revealed his character to witnesses he could not control. Emily did not need to respond publicly. She did not need to correct him. The process her father had put in place would do that far more effectively. And as the night settled into quiet, Emily Johnson understood something with absolute certainty. Whatever Mark believed he had gained that day, he had already forfeited far more. The funeral did not end when the final prayer was spoken. For Emily Johnson, it lingered in the quiet that followed, in the way certain faces avoided her eyes and how others looked at her, with a sympathy sharpened by judgment they did not dare voice aloud. She absorbed it all, without visible reaction, the way she had learned to absorb things that mattered. Mark Johnson, however, felt the aftershocks immediately. As the hall emptied, he became acutely aware of his isolation. Conversations resumed elsewhere, but they did not include him. Guests who had once greeted him warmly now offered only restrained nods. Some looked at Ashley, then quickly away, uncomfortable with their own curiosity. Mark told himself it was temporary. Funerals, he reasoned, made people sensitive. He convinced himself that once emotions settled, his decision would be understood as honesty rather than cruelty. Ashley did not share his confidence. She stood beside him, her posture stiff, her earlier resolve thinning by the minute. She had expected confrontation, something loud, something definitive. Instead, Emily's silence left her unanchored. There was no role to play against indifference. "Should we go?" Ashley asked quietly. Mark hesitated. He scanned the room, searching for Emily, expecting still that she would approach him. When she did not, irritation crept in. "She's being dramatic," he said under his breath. "This is her way of punishing me." Ashley nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. They left without speaking to anyone. Emily remained behind to oversee final arrangements. She spoke briefly with the officiant, thanked the staff, and confirmed details for the burial that would follow privately. Each interaction was efficient, contained and free of unnecessary emotion. When she finally stepped outside, the air felt different. The day was overcast, the kind of muted light that softened edges rather than sharpening them. Emily stood still for a moment, allowing herself a breath she had postponed since morning. Then she reached for her phone. There were messages waiting, condolences, inquiries, and from Mark, a single text sent moments after he left. "We need to talk." Emily did not reply. Instead, she opened a different folder, one she had not accessed since before the funeral. Inside were documents prepared by Daniel Brooks, each labeled each, dated each, already executed. She reviewed them again, not because she needed to, but because repetition reinforced certainty. The will had been finalized weeks before Robert Whitman's death. The trust had been activated immediately upon certification. The assets, $300 million distributed across diversified holdings, were already legally insulated. Mark's name appeared nowhere. Emily closed the folder and put the phone away. That evening, she returned to the house she and Mark still shared. The silence inside felt heavier than usual, not because it was empty, but because it was unresolved. Mark was not home. His absence did not surprise her. She prepared a simple meal and ate alone. Then she gathered a small stack of personal items, documents, journals, records she had kept meticulously, and placed them in a locked drawer. The act was not symbolic. It was practical. Mark returned late. He did not announce himself. Emily heard the door close, the sound of keys tossed onto the counter. He entered the room with an expression that suggested restraint rather than remorse. "We need to clear the air," he said. Emily looked up from what she was doing. "You can speak," she replied calmly. Mark launched into explanation, carefully framed, self-serving. He spoke of honesty, of refusing to live a lie. He said the funeral was unfortunate timing, but insisted that truth could not wait for convenience. He accused Emily of emotional distance, of disengagement, of failing to fight for the marriage. Emily listened without interruption. When he finished, he waited for a response. "What you did today," Emily said finally, "was not honest. It was deliberate." Mark bristled. "You're twisting it." "No," she replied. "I'm naming it." Her tone was not angry. It was precise. That precision unsettled him more than raised voices ever had. "You wanted witnesses," she continued. "You chose a place where I could not respond without becoming what you already believe I am." Mark scoffed. "You didn't respond because you couldn't." Emily met his gaze steadily. "I didn't respond because it wasn't necessary." That night, Mark slept restlessly. He sensed a shift. He could not articulate a loss of control that manifested not in confrontation, but in omission. Emily did not argue. She did not demand explanations. She did not seek reassurance. The next morning, she left early. Emily met Laura Stein later that day in an office that reflected its owner's temperament: minimalist, efficient, impersonal. Laura listened as Emily spoke, not emotionally, not defensively, but factually. She described Mark's behavior. She provided timelines. She handed over documentation, emails, financial records, messages archived carefully over months. Laura reviewed them with practiced detachment. "You've been preparing for this," Laura observed. "Yes," Emily said simply. They discussed options, legal boundaries, strategy. Laura explained the implications of infidelity under state law, particularly when marital assets were involved. She spoke about discretion, about timing, about allowing evidence to speak louder than accusation. Emily agreed with every recommendation. When she left the office, there was no sense of triumph, only clarity. Mark, meanwhile, continued operating under assumptions that no longer applied. He spoke to Ashley confidently, assuring her that things would resolve themselves. He believed Emily's restraint indicated surrender. He underestimated the difference between silence born of fear and silence chosen deliberately. In the days following the funeral, Mark noticed changes, but misread them entirely. Emily stopped asking questions. She stopped updating him on her schedule. She moved with quiet independence, as if I am already detached. He interpreted this as emotional withdrawal, not procedural alignment. He did not realize that Emily Johnson had already stepped beyond the point where emotional explanations mattered. The funeral had done what arguments could not. It had documented Mark's character publicly without Emily having to say a word. It had provided context, witnesses, and a moment that would never be forgotten. And now, with the legal machinery set in motion, Emily did not need to hurry. The slow burn her father had taught her, the discipline of waiting until action carried unavoidable consequence, was already underway. Mark had mistaken the end of the funeral for the end of scrutiny. In truth, it had only marked the beginning. The will was not a document Mark Johnson ever thought to ask about. He assumed it would be simple, symbolic even. A modest distribution of personal effects, perhaps a donation or two. Robert Whitman, in Mark's mind, had lived carefully because he had little to spare. The idea that there might be complexity, let alone consequence, never occurred to him. Emily knew otherwise. She had known for years that her father's quiet was not absence, but intention. Robert did not speak about money, because he did not need to. He spoke instead about structure, about continuity, about the danger of visibility without control. When he talked about responsibility, he did so without reference to numbers, as if the concept existed independently of scale. In the weeks before his death, Robert had asked Emily only one thing of consequence, that she read everything herself. Daniel Brooks had explained the framework patiently, without drama. He had laid out the trust not as a weapon, but as a boundary. Assets would be placed beyond immediate reach. Control would be separated from visibility. Beneficiary rights would be clear, irrevocable, and insulated from marital claim. Emily listened carefully. She asked questions. She took notes. Mark's name never appeared in the documents. This omission was not punitive. It was deliberate. Robert Whitman had structured his estate the way he had lived his life, anticipating human behavior rather than trusting it. He understood that money, when made visible, altered relationships irreversibly. He had seen how entitlement disguised itself as partnership. He had chosen to protect his daughter, not by confronting Mark, but by rendering Mark irrelevant. The will was executed quietly, without ceremony. There were no announcements, no warnings, no dramatic reveal. Robert did not believe in using death as a stage. By the time Mark stood beside Ashley at the funeral, the trust had already taken effect. Emily did not feel triumph when she learned this. She felt relief. Relief that her father's foresight had removed uncertainty. Relief that decisions would now be governed by language precise enough to withstand interpretation. Relief that whatever Mark chose to do next would unfold without her needing to negotiate her own security. Mark, however, remained unaware. In the days following the funeral, he continued behaving as though Emily's composure masked vulnerability. He spoke to friends about complicated transitions and necessary honesty. He framed himself as someone moving forward despite resistance. He did not realize that Emily had already moved beyond the terrain he believed himself to occupy. Emily met Daniel Brooks one final time, not to learn new information, but to confirm timing. The trust's activation had been immediate. The accounts were sealed. Oversight mechanisms were in place. Any attempt to access influence or claim authority would be documented automatically. "Nothing here requires reaction," Daniel said. "Only patience." Emily appreciated that. Patience had always been her strength. She returned home that evening to find Mark unusually attentive. He asked about her day. He commented on her appearance. He suggested dinner, something he hadn't done in months. Emily declined politely. "I have plans," she said. Mark's expression tightened. "With who?" "That's not relevant," Emily replied. The shift unsettled him. He was accustomed to proximity, to knowing where Emily was, what she was doing, how her time aligned with his. Her independence felt sudden, even though it had been forming quietly for years. He told himself it was temporary. Later that night, Mark sent an email, careless, unfiltered. He complained to a colleague about the funeral, about Emily's theatrics, about how some people pretended to be humble while hiding nothing worth finding. He expressed frustration that his life had been slowed by obligations that no longer reflected his future. Emily read the email the next morning. She did not respond. She forwarded it to a secure folder instead. Mark did not know that the will's language anticipated this exact kind of behavior, not because Robert Whitman knew what Mark would say, but because he understood what Mark believed about himself. The trust did not rely on moral judgment. It relied on predictability. Emily spent the next few days reviewing the implications, not emotionally, but procedurally. She learned which decisions required her signature, which ones would proceed without it, which disclosures were mandatory and which were optional. She did not rush to tell anyone. Mark grew impatient. He asked questions that assumed authority about finances, about timelines, about what Emily planned to do next. She answered them vaguely, without contradiction. He mistook her neutrality for compliance. Ashley, sensing Mark's growing agitation, pressed him for clarity. She wanted reassurance about stability, about resources, about what kind of future he could offer her. Mark offered confidence instead. Emily watched this from a distance, aware that confidence was not a substitute for capacity. The will, when finally read aloud weeks later, would not shock Emily. It would not humiliate Mark publicly. It would simply state facts. Robert Whitman had left his daughter everything, not as inheritance, but as stewardship. The assets were not gifts. They were responsibilities structured to outlast emotion. Emily understood that distinction completely. Mark did not. As the days passed, Emily felt no urgency to reveal what she knew. There was no advantage in confrontation. No satisfaction in premature disclosure. The will would speak when it was time. Until then, silence remained her most effective ally. Mark continued to mistake it for weakness. He did not understand that silence, when backed by law, required no volume to be decisive. The money changed nothing, at least not on the surface. When Emily Johnson became the sole beneficiary of a $300 million trust, the world did not tilt. The house did not transform. Her schedule did not expand. She did not make announcements or adjustments meant to signal arrival. She continued waking early, preparing her own coffee, moving through days with the same unremarkable cadence Mark had always mistaken for limitation. The difference existed elsewhere, in structure, not spectacle. Emily learned the architecture of the trust slowly, deliberately. She studied how assets were distributed across diversified holdings, how liquidity was controlled, how oversight functioned without intrusion. The trust did not reward impulsive decisions. It required intention. It rewarded patience. This suited her. She discovered that authority did not need expression to exist. Control could be exercised quietly through alignment rather than assertion. Decisions did not require justification, only compliance with procedure. Mark, meanwhile, noticed none of it. He remained convinced that Emily's life revolved around him, that her stability depended on the marriage, that her silence was a concession rather than a choice. He continued to behave as though nothing fundamental had shifted, even as his own footing became less certain. Emily allowed that illusion to persist. When Mark asked about finances, she answered vaguely. When he spoke about future plans, she listened without commitment. She did not contradict him because contradiction would have acknowledged his authority to define the conversation. She preferred omission. At work, Emily did not announce changes. She did not leverage her position or adjust her demeanor. Colleagues continued to perceive her as they always had: capable, quiet, dependable. This consistency reinforced her credibility. People trusted what did not fluctuate. Privately, she began taking small strategic steps. She opened new accounts in her name as permitted by the trust's terms. She ensured communications were routed securely. She confirmed that all relevant notifications were directed to her alone. Each action was minor in isolation, but together they formed a boundary Mark would not notice until it closed. The trust, she realized, had been designed not to empower her in the abstract, but to protect her from interference. That protection extended to timing. Mark's impatience increased as Emily's availability diminished. She spent more time outside the house, more time in meetings she did not explain. He asked questions framed as concern, but delivered with suspicion. "You're distant," he said one evening, "ever since the funeral." Emily met his gaze evenly. Grief changes routines. Mark accepted that explanation, though it failed to satisfy him. He wanted reassurance that he still mattered, that he remained central. Emily offered neither confirmation nor denial. Ashley, sensing the shift, pressed Mark for details he could not provide. She wanted clarity about housing, about finances, about stability. Mark assured her that everything would work out. He spoke confidently, not because he knew, but because confidence had always been his default response to uncertainty. Emily listened to these assurances secondhand through patterns rather than words. She noticed Mark's spending increased small indulgences justified as stress relief. She observed how he framed expenses as temporary, how he spoke about the future, as though resources would adjust automatically. She did not intervene. She documented. The trust's oversight mechanisms functioned exactly as Daniel Brooks had described. Transactions were flagged, patterns were noted. Emily reviewed summaries weekly, not because she was concerned, but because familiarity prevented surprise. She understood now why her father had insisted on separation between ownership and control. Money, when unobserved, invited assumptions. When observed quietly, it revealed intentions. Mark assumed he had time. He believed Emily's restraint indicated indecision. He mistook her calm for confusion. He began speaking openly about change, not just to Ashley, but to others. He spoke as though the marriage were already an artifact, something he had outgrown. Emily did not correct the narrative. She had no interest in defending a story Mark was determined to tell. She was more concerned with ensuring that when the story ended, it did so accurately. One evening, Mark attempted to reassert familiarity. He suggested they review finances together, framing it as transparency. Emily agreed without enthusiasm. They sat at the dining table, documents spread between them. Mark spoke confidently, outlining assumptions about income expenses and future adjustments. He referenced figures he believed he understood. Emily listened, then asked a single question. "Which accounts are you referring to?" Mark hesitated. "Ours," he said, "the usual ones." Emily nodded. "Those no longer reflect the whole picture." Mark frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Emily said calmly, "that you're working with incomplete information." The statement unsettled him. He searched her expression for clarification, for reassurance. She offered none. "That's not fair," he said. "We're married." Emily did not respond immediately. When she did, her tone remained even. "Marriage doesn't guarantee access," she said. "It guarantees obligation." Mark scoffed, dismissing the comment as semantics. He did not know that the trust had already rendered his assumptions obsolete. In the days that followed, Emily continued operating with deliberate normalcy. She did not escalate. She did not provoke. She allowed Mark's impatience to grow unchecked, knowing that impatience often produced evidence. Her father's voice echoed in her memory not as instruction but as principle. Structure outlasts emotion. The money did not change Emily's character. It did not grant her confidence she lacked. It simply removed vulnerability she had never acknowledged publicly. Mark remained convinced that whatever Emily possessed was temporary, contingent, negotiable. He did not realize that the trust had been designed precisely to counter that belief. As Emily reviewed the trust's terms once more, she understood the finality of what her father had done. He had not given her leverage for confrontation. He had given her insulation from it. The money, immense as it was, had not altered her trajectory. It had clarified it. And while Mark continued to operate under assumptions that no longer applied, Emily Johnson moved forward quietly, legally, and without urgency toward an outcome already secured. Emily Johnson did not think of what she was doing as preparation for divorce. To her, it was simply alignment. After the funeral, after the trust had been activated, and the reality of her father's foresight had settled into something solid and dependable, Emily turned her attention to the only remaining area of uncertainty, her marriage. Not emotionally, she had already accepted what it was and what it was not, but structurally. She scheduled her meeting with Laura Stein on a Tuesday morning, early enough that the office still smelled faintly of cleaning solution and coffee. Laura's practice specialized in complex marital dissolutions, the kind that did not benefit from theatrics or speed. Emily appreciated that. Laura listened without interruption as Emily outlined the facts. She did not editorialize. She did not frame herself as a victim or Mark as a villain. She described behavior timelines and patterns. She explained how Mark had introduced Ashley at the funeral. She detailed the financial inconsistencies she had observed. She handed over folders, emails, bank statements, message logs, each labeled dated and complete. Laura reviewed the materials carefully. "You've been documenting for a while," she observed. Emily nodded. "I didn't know I would need to," she said, "but I knew I might." Laura did not smile. She did not praise Emily's foresight. She simply explained the implications. Under state law, Mark's actions mattered, not morally, but materially. Funds spent on an extramarital relationship using marital assets constituted misuse. Public conduct that demonstrated abandonment or bad faith could influence proceedings. Timing mattered, disclosure mattered, and above all, evidence mattered. Emily absorbed the information calmly. They discussed strategy not in terms of retaliation, but containment. Laura advised against immediate confrontation. She explained that premature disclosure often prompted defensive behavior, asset concealment, narrative manipulation, legal posturing. "Let the record speak first," Laura said. "Then act." Emily agreed. In the weeks that followed, Emily's life appeared unchanged to anyone watching casually. She went to work. She came home. She spoke to Mark when necessary and disengaged when conversation drifted toward assumption or entitlement. Privately, she continued her documentation. She reviewed financial records monthly, then weekly. She tracked discrepancies, noting which expenditures aligned with routine and which did not. She preserved messages Mark did not realize were revealing complaints framed as jokes, dismissive comments delivered casually, assumptions written down without caution. Emily did not provoke him into error. She allowed him to be himself. Mark's behavior grew increasingly careless as his confidence expanded. He stopped concealing his frustration. He wrote emails he assumed would never be read outside their intended audience. He spoke openly about starting fresh, about being done with compromise. Emily read everything. She also learned what not to do. She did not drain accounts. She did not move assets prematurely. She did not engage in behavior that could be framed as reactive. Laura had been clear the strength of Emily's position lay in her consistency. Any deviation could be misinterpreted. So Emily remained steady. Mark, sensing the distance, but misunderstanding its source, attempted to reassert control in subtle ways. He questioned her schedule. He commented on her absence. He framed concern as authority. "You're shutting me out," he said one evening. "We're supposed to be a team." Emily looked at him calmly. Teams require shared intent. The statement unsettled him. He accused her of being evasive. She did not respond. Ashley, meanwhile, grew restless. She wanted clarity Mark could not provide. She wanted assurances about security, about housing, about financial stability, about legitimacy. Mark reassured her with confidence rather than facts. He spoke of options he assumed would materialize. Emily became aware of these conversations through fragments Mark's tone, his sudden defensiveness, the way he spoke about money, as if it were elastic. She documented the shifts. One evening, Mark made a mistake that seemed insignificant to him at the time. He left his laptop open. Emily did not search it. She did not scroll through personal files. She did not invade privacy. She simply noticed an email preview visible on the screen, one he had typed hastily without caution. It contained a sentence that caught her attention immediately. "Once this is over, everything will be simpler." Emily memorized the timestamp. The following day, she accessed the shared server where Mark stored work-related correspondence. The email appeared there as well, sent archived and unprotected. She saved a copy without altering its original location. She did not forward it. She did not print it. She preserved it. When she showed the email to Laura later that week, Laura nodded slowly. "This is useful," she said. Not because of what it says explicitly, but because of what it assumes. Emily understood. The email assumed outcome. It assumed entitlement. It assumed access that had never been secured. Mark continued operating under those assumptions. He increased his spending. He spoke openly about moving. He hinted at timelines he believed he controlled. Each action added to a record he never imagined existed. Emily's restraint confused him. He accused her of being cold, of being passive-aggressive, of withholding emotion. She accepted the accusations without defense. She knew that any emotional response would only validate his perception that the conflict was personal. Emily understood that it was procedural. By the end of the month, Laura had enough to proceed. She did not advise immediate filing. Instead, she suggested waiting, allowing Mark's behavior to stabilize into pattern rather than incident. "Patterns are harder to dispute," Laura said. Emily agreed. During this time, Emily also took steps to protect herself personally. She updated passwords. She secured personal documents. She arranged for alternate housing should it become necessary. Each step was quiet, reversible, and legal. Mark noticed none of it. He continued speaking as though the future were his to narrate. He believed Emily's silence indicated fear of disruption. He did not consider that she might simply be waiting for the appropriate moment to act. Emily did not rush that moment. She trusted process over impulse. She trusted documentation over accusation. She trusted the structures her father had taught her to rely on. What Mark mistook for indecision was in fact discipline. And as Emily reviewed her records one final time, she understood that the path ahead did not require confrontation. It required patience. The law, once engaged properly, would do the speaking. The mistake Mark Johnson made did not arrive with the drama. It came quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as confidence. By the time it happened, Mark had grown accustomed to the idea that nothing he said or wrote would carry consequences beyond momentary irritation. Emily's silence had taught him the wrong lesson. He believed discretion protected him. He believed familiarity excused carelessness. He was wrong. The email was sent late on a Thursday night after a long dinner and a longer conversation Mark did not enjoy. Ashley had asked questions again about money, about timing, about what exactly would change once his marriage was resolved. Mark had grown impatient. He wanted the questions to stop. So he wrote. The message was addressed to Ashley, copied to no one else. In it, he complained openly about Emily. He dismissed her grief as performance. He described the funeral as unnecessary theater. He referred to Robert Whitman's life as carefully hidden nothing, and to Emily as someone who had never understood how the real world worked. He assured Ashley that things would change soon. "Once this is finalized," He wrote, "Everything will be simpler. The money situation will correct itself." The phrasing was casual, unexamined. Mark did not consider what the sentence implied, that money existed to be corrected, that outcomes were assumed rather than earned, that authority was presumed rather than established. He clicked send without hesitation. Emily discovered the email the next morning. Mark had forwarded it to his personal account automatically, a habit he had developed to access messages across devices. The message appeared in a shared archive, one Emily had access to by design, not intrusion. She did not open it immediately. She noted the subject line. She noted the time. When she did read it, she did so carefully, without reaction. The email was not explosive. It did not contain threats or explicit admissions. What made it significant was its tone, the assumptions embedded within it, the casual confidence that suggested intent. Emily saved a copy. She preserved the metadata. She did not alter the file. She did not forward it to herself in a way that would trigger notification. She stored it exactly as Laura had instructed, unchanged, intact, verifiable. Then she closed the folder. Mark did not notice anything different that day. He went to work. He texted Ashley. He returned home with the same restless impatience that had become his default. Emily behaved as she always had. That evening, she asked him a neutral question. "When do you think clarity becomes necessary?" she asked. Mark looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "You talk a lot about the future," Emily said calmly. "I'm wondering when you think things stop being assumed and start being decided." Mark laughed, dismissive. "You're overthinking it." Emily nodded. "Possibly." The conversation ended there. The following week, Mark made the mistake again, this time in a different form. He complained to a colleague over email about being stuck and waiting for paperwork. He framed Emily as an obstacle, a delay, a complication that would soon be removed. He referenced finances loosely, implying access without authority. Emily found that email as well. She saved it. When she met Laura Stein days later, she brought both messages. Laura read them slowly without interruption. When she finished, she looked up. "These aren't confessions," Laura said. "They're better." Emily waited. "They establish expectation," Laura continued. "They show that he believes outcomes are owed to him, that he's acting in anticipation of authority he doesn't possess." Laura explained how courts interpreted such language not emotionally but inferentially. Assumption of entitlement, particularly when paired with financial behavior, suggested bad faith. It demonstrated intent without requiring explicit declaration. Emily understood immediately. Mark's words did not need to condemn him. They only needed to reveal him. Laura advised patience, but with purpose. "Let him continue," she said. "Patterns strengthen arguments." Emily did not need encouragement. Mark, emboldened by what he believed was progress, grew even more careless. He spoke freely. He wrote freely. He allowed his confidence to leak into formats that would outlast explanation. Ashley, sensing momentum, responded eagerly. Her replies reinforced Mark's assumptions. She asked about shared plans, about housing, about stability. Her questions, preserved alongside his assurances, created context. Emily documented everything. She did not feel anger as she read the exchanges. She felt clarity. Each message removed ambiguity. Each careless phrase narrowed the range of interpretation. Mark noticed Emily's distance more acutely now. He accused her of disengagement. He framed her calm as manipulation. "You're acting like you're above this," he said one night. "Like you're waiting for something." Emily met his gaze evenly. "I am." The statement unsettled him. He demanded explanation. She offered none. In the days that followed, Mark's spending increased again. He justified it as preparation. He referenced the transition casually, as if the outcome were already settled. Emily reviewed the bank statements with quiet focus. Each charge aligned with the narrative Mark was writing for himself. When she forwarded the updated records to Laura, Laura did not express surprise. "This is enough," she said. Emily nodded. For the first time, the path forward felt not just clear but inevitable. The evidence did not rely on interpretation. It did not require persuasion. It simply existed. Mark had written himself into a corner without realizing it. His emails would not embarrass him publicly. They would not shame him socially. They would do something far more effective. They would stand, unemotional, undeniable, uninterested in excuses. Emily closed her laptop that evening with a sense of finality she had not felt before. Not relief, not triumph, completion. The slow burn had reached a point where heat no longer needed to be applied. The record was complete, and when the time came for law to speak, it would do so using Mark's own words. Money rarely announces itself when it becomes a problem. It shifts quietly through small withdrawals, unremarkable charges, routine transactions that seem insignificant on their own. Emily Johnson understood this better than most. She had grown up watching her father treat money, not as a display of success, but as a system that required discipline to remain invisible. So when Emily began reviewing the bank records in earnest, she did not look for scandal. She looked for patterns. The accounts Mark and Emily shared had once been predictable. Utilities, groceries, insurance, occasional travel, the rhythm of a stable life. But over time, that rhythm had changed. New categories appeared. Restaurants she had never visited, retailers she did not recognize, travel expenses that did not align with Mark's stated work obligations. Emily did not confront him about any of it. She exported the statements instead. Each month, she compared them side by side, noting increases in consistencies and timing. Certain charges clustered together hotel stays followed by dining expenses in unfamiliar locations. Purchases that coincided precisely with Mark's unexplained absences. Individually, none of it appeared extraordinary. Collectively, it told a story. Emily traced the spending, carefully correlating dates with emails she had already preserved. Messages sent late at night, assurances written casually, references to plans that required resources Mark had never secured. The picture sharpened. Mark was not hiding his behavior particularly well. He was simply assuming it would never be examined. Emily forwarded the compiled records to Laura Stein without commentary. Laura reviewed them methodically, highlighting transactions, grouping expenditures, identifying which funds originated from marital assets. This matters, Laura said during their next meeting. Not because of the amounts, but because of intent. Emily listened. Under the law, money spent on an extramarital relationship using shared funds constituted misuse. It demonstrated breach not of emotion, but of obligation. Courts did not concern themselves with heartbreak. They concerned themselves with accountability. The bank records did more than confirm Mark's affair. They revealed his assumptions. He had acted as though shared money was already his alone, as though future outcomes justified present access, as though authority followed desire. Emily absorbed this calmly. She did not feel vindicated. She felt confirmed. In the weeks that followed, Mark grew more careless. He no longer attempted to conceal his spending. He framed expenses as temporary, necessary, inevitable. When Emily asked neutral questions about a charge about timing, he responded defensively. "You're micromanaging," he accused once. "This is exactly why things stopped working." Emily did not respond. She knew that defensiveness often preceded error. One afternoon, Mark attempted to move funds between accounts, an action he had never taken before. The amount was not substantial, but the intent was clear. He assumed he could reallocate resources without consequence. The system flagged the transaction automatically. Emily received notification within minutes. She did not intervene. She documented. When she showed Laura the alert, Laura nodded. "This establishes escalation," she said. "Not misuse alone, but attempted control," Emily understood. Mark, unaware of the oversight mechanisms now governing the accounts, grew increasingly frustrated. He complained about restrictions he could not explain. He blamed bureaucracy. He blamed timing. He blamed Emily. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said one evening. "We could resolve this like adults." Emily looked at him steadily. Adults respect boundaries. Mark scoffed. You're hiding behind paperwork. Emily did not correct him. In truth, paperwork was doing precisely what it was designed to do, remove ambiguity. Ashley, meanwhile, sensed the tension. She pressed Mark for clarity again, for reassurance that his confidence was grounded in reality. Mark responded with irritation, then reassurance, then deflection. Emily observed the effect indirectly. The messages Ashley sent Mark grew more urgent. Her tone shifted from excitement to concern. She asked questions Mark could not answer definitively. She referenced expenses, plans, timelines. Emily preserved those messages as well. The bank records continued to accumulate. Each new statement reinforced the pattern. Each attempted transaction revealed another assumption Mark had never thought to examine. Emily met with Laura again at the end of the quarter. This is more than sufficient, Laura said. We can proceed whenever you're ready. Emily did not answer immediately. She considered timing not from fear, but from strategy. Mark was still revealing himself. His behavior had not stabilized yet. He was still acting on the belief that control was inevitable. She decided to wait. Laura did not object. Waiting doesn't weaken your position, she said. It strengthens it. Emily returned home that evening to find Mark unusually agitated. He complained about work, about delays, about feeling constrained. He spoke as though the world were conspiring to slow him down. Emily listened. You don't trust me anymore, Mark said suddenly. That's what this is. Emily met his gaze. Trust isn't something you declare, she replied. It's something you preserve. Mark laughed, sharp and humorless. You always talk like this, he said, like you're documenting instead of living. Emily said nothing. He did not realize how accurate the statement was. That night, Emily reviewed the records one final time. The evidence was no longer fragmentary. It was cohesive. Financial misuse, documented intent, attempted control, patterns sustained over time. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just facts. Emily closed the folder and set it aside. The bank records had done their work. They had transformed assumption into documentation. They had removed the need for confrontation. When the time came, Mark would not be undone by accusation. He would be undone by arithmetic. And Emily Johnson, who had never raised her voice or demanded acknowledgement, understood that the most decisive forms of justice rarely required volume. They required records. The day the lawyers spoke was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no sudden revelations delivered for effect. It unfolded in a conference room that looked like every other conference room, neutral walls, a polished table, a pitcher of water untouched. The setting was intentional. Nothing about it invited emotion. Emily Johnson arrived first. She sat with her back straight, a thin folder placed neatly in front of her. Laura Stein sat beside her, reviewing notes with quiet focus. Neither of them spoke while they waited. There was nothing left to rehearse. Mark Johnson arrived several minutes late. He entered the room with a confidence that no longer matched his circumstances. His posture suggested irritation rather than concern, as though this meeting were an inconvenience imposed upon him rather than a consequence of his own actions. Ashley Miller did not accompany him. She had asked to come. Mark had refused. This is between my wife and me, he had said. Emily noted that phrasing without reaction. Mark took a seat across from her, glanced briefly at Laura, and then looked back at Emily expectantly, as if waiting for her to begin. Laura spoke instead. She introduced herself, outlined the purpose of the meeting, and clarified representation. Her tone was professional, neutral, and deliberately uninviting. She explained that the discussion would concern financial disclosure, marital obligations, and procedural next steps. Mark leaned back in his chair. Let's not make this more complicated than it is, he said. We both know where this is heading. Emily remained silent. Laura did not respond to the comment directly. She opened a folder and slid a document across the table, not toward Mark, but toward Emily. This, Laura said, is confirmation of trust activation. Mark frowned. What trust? Laura turned her attention to him, then her expression unchanged. The Whitman family trust, she said, established prior to Robert Whitman's passing. Sole beneficiary Emily Johnson. The room shifted. Mark laughed once sharply. That's not funny. Laura did not smile. She slid another document forward. This trust holds assets valued at approximately $300 million, she continued. They are insulated from marital claim under state law and were activated upon certification of death. Mark stared at the papers, then at Emily. That's not possible, he said. Her father didn't have that kind of money. Emily met his gaze calmly. He never asked. Mark's face flushed. This has to be some kind of technicality. Laura shook her head. It's not. She explained the structure carefully. The separation of ownership and control, the legal protections in place, the oversight mechanisms that ensured compliance. She spoke without emphasis, without judgment. Mark listened in silence, his earlier confidence eroding with each sentence. So what, he said finally. You're saying I'm cut out? Laura corrected him gently. You were never in. The words landed without cruelty, but with finality. Mark turned to Emily. You knew about this. Yes, Emily said. And you didn't tell me. Emily paused before answering. You never asked what you assumed didn't exist. Mark's reaction shifted from disbelief to indignation. He accused her of deception, of manipulation, of withholding information that should have been shared. Laura intervened calmly. Disclosure of inherited assets protected by trust is not required under the circumstances you're describing, she said, especially given documented misuse of marital funds. Mark froze. What misuse? Laura slid another folder onto the table. Inside were bank statements, transaction summaries, highlighted charges. Each document was labeled dated and cross-referenced. Laura did not explain them immediately. She allowed Mark to look. As he read, his expression changed. These are normal expenses, he said weakly. Laura nodded. Individually, yes. Collectively, no. She explained how the spending aligned with documented extramarital activity, how the timing correlated with messages and travel, how the attempted transfer of funds established intent to exert control. Mark's voice rose. This is an ambush. Emily spoke for the first time since the trust was revealed. It's a record, she said. One you created. Mark looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Not as a passive presence, but as a participant he had underestimated. And Ashley, he demanded suddenly. Is she part of this too? Laura answered before Emily could. Ashley Miller is not a party to this proceeding, she said. However, her communications appear in the documentation. Mark's composure fractured. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, gesturing as though movement might restore control. You planned this, he said to Emily. You waited. Emily remained seated. I followed procedure. That's not the same thing. Emily's tone did not change. It is when procedure replaces trust. Mark stopped pacing. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was not a negotiation. There was no argument that would alter the framework now laid out before him. The trust existed. The records existed. The law did not require his agreement. Laura outlined next steps. Filing timelines, disclosure requirements, temporary orders. She spoke about separation of finances, occupancy, and legal boundaries. Mark listened, but the fight had gone out of him. When the meeting ended, he gathered his belongings slowly. He did not look at Emily as he stood. He directed one final question at Laura. So what happens now? Laura answered plainly. Now the process continues. Outside, the light was sharp and unforgiving. Mark stood on the sidewalk for a moment, as if disoriented. Emily passed him without stopping. He called her name. Emily turned once. I never thought you'd do this, he said. Emily regarded him calmly. You never thought I could. She walked away then, not quickly, not dramatically, just forward. The meeting had done what it was meant to do. It had replaced assumption with structure confidence, with documentation dominance, with law. Emily did not feel satisfaction. She felt resolution. And for the first time since the funeral, the silence around her no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. The end of the marriage did not arrive all at once. It unfolded through filings, deadlines, and procedural language that stripped emotion from what had once been intimate. Emily Johnson experienced it not as a collapse, but as a narrowing each step, reducing uncertainty, each document clarifying what would no longer be negotiated. Laura Stein filed the initial papers without urgency. There was no advantage in speed now. The record was complete. The framework was set. What remained was execution. Mark Johnson responded as expected. At first, he attempted resistance through denial. He questioned the validity of the trust, suggested impropriety, hinted at hidden influence. None of it gained traction. The trust had been established long before conflict could be alleged. Its language was precise. Its timing unimpeachable. When denial failed, Mark shifted to indignation. He argued fairness. He argued contribution. He framed the marriage as a partnership whose benefits had been unfairly withheld. His filings emphasized effort over outcome, presence over conduct. Emily read his statements carefully. She did not respond emotionally. She responded factually. Laura drafted replies that addressed each claim without escalation. Where Mark asserted entitlement, the response cited statute. Where he implied injustice, the response referenced timing. Where he framed himself as disadvantaged, the response documented behavior. The court did not require narrative. It required substantiation. As proceedings moved forward, temporary orders were issued. Finances were separated formally. Access was defined. Boundaries were enforced. Mark felt the shift immediately. Accounts he once assumed were available became restricted. Decisions he believed he could delay proceeded without his input. He experienced the consequences not as punishment, but as removal of access, of influence, of assumed authority. Ashley Miller felt it too. She had expected clarity to arrive with the meeting. Instead, uncertainty expanded. Mark could no longer reassure her with confidence alone. Timelines shifted, plans dissolved, conversations grew tense. Emily observed this from a distance. She did not involve herself. She did not comment. Ashley was not her concern. The court scheduled mediation as required. Emily attended without expectation. She listened as Mark spoke at length about compromise, about starting over, about avoiding unnecessary conflict. He framed concessions as generosity. He asked for flexibility, appealing to reason where authority had failed. Emily responded with brevity. She did not contest what did not matter. She did not concede what was protected. Her answers were measured, limited to what the law required her to address. The mediator noticed immediately. "This isn't about winning," he remarked at one point. "It's about structure." Emily nodded. "Exactly." Mark bristled. He accused Emily of being cold, of reducing a marriage to paperwork, of hiding behind legal technicalities to avoid accountability. Emily did not react. When the session ended without resolution, because Mark continued to negotiate against a framework that could not be altered, the process advanced automatically. Discovery concluded quickly. There was nothing left to uncover. No hidden accounts, no disputed valuations. The trust was outside the marital estate. The bank records were clear. The documentation spoke consistently. Mark's legal counsel adjusted strategy accordingly. The arguments softened. The demands narrowed. Reality began asserting itself in places confidence once occupied. Emily experienced none of this as vindication. She experienced it as closure. On the day the final decree was drafted, Emily reviewed it carefully, not for emotional reassurance, but for accuracy. Names, dates, terms. She confirmed each section methodically. The marriage was dissolved. Property division followed statute. Shared assets were allocated fairly. Misused funds were addressed precisely. There was no public spectacle, no commentary, no judgment beyond what the law required. Mark signed the documents with visible restraint. When Emily signed, her hand did not shake. Afterward, they stood briefly in the hallway outside the courtroom. There were no witnesses, no dramatic exchanges. Just two people occupying the same space for the last time, under shared designation. Mark spoke first. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. Emily looked at him calmly. This way ensured there would be no confusion. He laughed once bitterly. "You always needed control." Emily did not correct him. She understood now that Mark would always misinterpret restraint as dominance, clarity as manipulation, preparation as threat. His perceptions no longer required her attention. She walked away without looking back. In the weeks that followed, Emily transitioned quietly. She moved out of the house they had shared not abruptly but deliberately. She took what was hers. She left what was not. She did not argue over objects whose meaning had dissolved. Her new space was modest, intentional, free of association. Mark attempted contact once an email framed as reflection. He spoke about regret, about misunderstanding, about how things might have been different if he had known more. Emily did not respond. She archived the message and closed the folder. The legal end of the marriage did not feel like victory. It felt like alignment between truth and record, between behavior and consequence, between silence and outcome. Emily did not celebrate. She did not mourn. She simply continued. And in doing so, she confirmed what Mark had never understood, that dignity did not require confrontation and justice did not require spectacle. It required consistency. Emily Johnson left the marriage the same way she had endured it, without announcement. There was no dramatic exit, no final conversation staged for closure. She did not wait for Mark to be absent, nor did she coordinate her departure to avoid him deliberately. When the legal separation permitted the move, she began packing methodically, room by room, choosing what belonged to her not by habit, but by intention. Some things she left behind without hesitation. Furniture they had chosen together. Decorative items whose only purpose had been to fill space. Objects that carried no memory worth preserving. Others she took carefully, documents, books, a small collection of notebooks she'd kept over the years. Not because they were sentimental, but because they represented continuity. Mark watched this process with visible confusion. He hovered in doorways, occasionally offering commentary that sounded more like accusation than curiosity. He asked where she was going. He asked how long she planned to be gone. He asked questions that assumed proximity would continue in some form. Emily answered only what was necessary. "I've arranged housing," she said. "The movers are coming Friday. The rest is handled." Mark interpreted her efficiency as cruelty. "You're acting like none of this mattered," he said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. Emily paused, folding a shirt with care before placing it into a box. "It mattered," she replied. "That's why it's finished." The statement unsettled him. He wanted conflict, something loud enough to reassure him that the dissolution of the marriage was an emotional failure rather than a structural conclusion. Emily offered neither. On the day she moved out, Mark did not leave the house. He stood in the living room as movers carried boxes past him, his presence heavy, performative. Emily thanked the movers, quietly signed the paperwork, and checked the list twice. When everything was done, she walked through the house once more, not to reminisce, but to confirm completeness. At the door, Mark spoke again. "You're really not going to look back?" he asked. Emily met his gaze calmly. "I already did," she said. "That's how I knew to leave." She closed the door behind her without ceremony. Her new apartment was smaller than the house they had shared. It lacked polish. The walls were bare when she arrived, but it felt neutral in a way the old house never had, unclaimed by expectation, free of narrative. Emily unpacked slowly. She placed items deliberately, allowing the space to remain sparse until it reflected her rather than habit. She cooked simply. She slept deeply. For the first time in months, there was no background tension, no unspoken negotiation humming beneath daily routines. Mark, by contrast, struggled with the absence. Without Emily's quiet presence to absorb his frustrations, the house felt cavernous. The assumptions he had relied on about support, about access, about inevitability, no longer held. Ashley's impatience grew sharper. Questions he once deflected now demanded answers. He could not provide them. Emily did not monitor his unraveling. She did not need to. She focused instead on continuity, on her work, on understanding the trust she now stewarded fully, on honoring her father's intention not through expansion or indulgence, but through responsibility. She met Daniel Brooks again, not for instruction, but for confirmation. "Everything is in order," he told her. "You're well positioned." Emily nodded. "I intend to keep it that way." She began volunteering her time, quietly consulting on projects that aligned with her values. She did not attach her name publicly. She preferred impact without attention. Friends noticed a change not in her demeanor, but in her availability. Emily was more present, more engaged. She laughed more easily, not because she was happier in any demonstrative way, but because effort was no longer wasted on maintaining appearances. One afternoon, Emily received a forwarded message from a mutual acquaintance. Mark had spoken publicly carelessly about being blindsided, about hidden money, about betrayal masked as composure. Emily read the message once, then closed it. She did not correct the narrative. She understood now that Mark would always need an external explanation for internal failures. His version of events required her to be deceptive so that he could remain unexamined. She declined the role. Months passed. The legal process concluded quietly. Final adjustments were made. Loose ends tied off. Emily signed the last document with the same steady hand she had used throughout. She felt no urge to announce completion. On the anniversary of her father's death, Emily visited his grave alone. She stood in silence, the wind moving softly through the trees. She did not speak aloud. She did not ask questions. She simply stood there, grounded, aware. Her father had not given her power to dominate. He had given her freedom from vulnerability. He had trusted her to choose restraint over retaliation, structure over spectacle. Emily had honored that trust. As she walked away from the cemetery, she did not feel triumph. She felt alignment. The marriage was over. The conflict resolved. The future unburdened by assumption. Emily Johnson moved forward without looking back, not because the past had no meaning, but because it no longer required her attention. She had left with her dignity intact. And that, she knew, was the only ending worth having. What remained after the funeral was not anger. Emily Johnson realized this gradually in the weeks after she had settled into her new life. The silence that followed the legal end of her marriage did not feel hollow or unresolved. It felt intentional, like the pause after a decision that had already been made, weighed and carried out with care. She did not replay the past obsessively. She did not revisit conversations searching for alternate endings. The story as it had unfolded no longer required interpretation. It had reached its conclusion through action rather than explanation. Emily's days took on a different rhythm. Without the constant undercurrent of negotiation, of managing someone else's expectations, time expanded. Mornings became unhurried. Evenings felt complete without being filled. She discovered that peace was not dramatic. It was consistent. She continued to work to meet obligations, to move forward. The trust her father had left her required attention, not indulgence. She approached it the way she approached everything else, with discipline. Decisions were reviewed. Advisors were consulted. No choice was made for appearance alone. Emily understood now that wealth, like silence, carried responsibility. Occasionally, memories surfaced, not as wounds, but as reference points. The image of the funeral returned once unexpectedly. Mark standing beside Ashley. The whispers. The assumptions made by people who believed they understood what they were seeing. At the time, those assumptions had felt heavy. Now they felt distant. Emily understood something she had not fully grasped then, that public humiliation only held power if it altered the truth. And the truth, she knew now, had never shifted. Mark's actions at the funeral had not diminished her. They had documented him. That distinction mattered. She heard fragments of Mark's life through mutual acquaintances, not by seeking them out, but by proximity. His plans had stalled. His explanations had grown repetitive. He spoke often of being misunderstood, of timing, of things not working out as expected. Emily did not respond to these reports. She no longer needed to correct the record. The record existed independently of her. Ashley, too, faded from relevance. Whatever role she had played in Mark's narrative dissolved once stability failed to materialize. Emily felt no resentment toward her. Ashley had believed what she had been told. That belief, Emily understood, was not malice. It was vulnerability. Emily reserved judgment for actions, not people. As months passed, the legal proceedings became memory rather than presence. Documents were filed away, accounts stabilized. Life resumed its forward motion. On quiet evenings, Emily sometimes returned to her notebooks, the ones she had kept for years without knowing exactly why. They were not diaries. They contained observations, dates, small details that once felt insignificant. She did not read them with bitterness. She read them with clarity. The notebooks reminded her of who she had always been, not passive, not unaware, but patient. They reminded her that silence, when chosen deliberately, was not absence. It was assessment. Emily did not feel the need to redefine herself publicly. She did not adopt a new persona or perform resilience. Her strength had never been performative. It had been structural. On the anniversary of the Trust's activation, Daniel Brooks sent a brief message, confirming everything remained in order. Emily replied with a simple acknowledgement. No celebration, no reflection. The structure held. That was enough. One afternoon, Emily passed the old house she and Mark had once shared. The sight did not provoke emotion. It felt like observing a place she had once visited rather than inhabited. The windows reflected the sky. The lawn was trimmed. Life had continued there without her, and she had continued without it. Emily thought then of her father, of the way he had lived quietly, deliberately, without confusing visibility with value. She understood now that he had not been preparing her for wealth. He had been preparing her for independence. The funeral, in retrospect, had not been a moment of loss alone. It had been a moment of revelation, one that required no response, no correction, no defense. The truth had emerged on its own through contrast. Emily had stood in silence, not because she lacked words, but because words would have cheapened what law, time, and consistency would reveal far more clearly. She had left the marriage without spectacle. She had claimed her future without noise. She had allowed others to tell their versions while she lived hers. And that she understood was the final distinction, not between wealth and poverty, not between betrayal and loyalty, but between reaction and resolve. Emily Johnson did not walk away with triumph. She walked away with alignment between who she had always been and the life she now lived. The story did not end with vindication. It ended with quiet continuity. What this story leaves behind is not the satisfaction of seeing someone fall, but the deeper understanding of how strength actually works. Emily Johnson never raised her voice. She never demanded explanations, never fought publicly for dignity, never tried to reclaim respect through humiliation. And yet, she never lost it. What she showed us quietly, consistently, is that power does not begin at the moment of confrontation. It begins much earlier in how we prepare, how we observe, and how we choose restraint over impulse. This story is not about money, even though money plays a role. It is about foresight, about understanding that fairness is not something we argue for emotionally, but something we secure structurally. Emily did not win because she was louder, smarter, or more aggressive. She prevailed because she trusted process over reaction, documentation over accusation, and law over drama. There is something deeply human in that choice. Many people believe silence means weakness. This story challenges that belief. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of clarity. It creates space for truth to surface on its own. It allows others to reveal themselves without interruption. And when accountability finally arrives, it does so without needing revenge to feel complete. Emily did not leave her marriage with triumph. She left with alignment between who she was, what she valued, and how she chose to live going forward. That is a quieter ending than most people expect, but it is also a far more lasting one. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever mistaken someone's silence for weakness, or been underestimated because you chose dignity over confrontation? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these moments matters more than advice. And if you value stories about quiet strength, legal justice, and dignity that doesn't need applause, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories exist to remind us that the most powerful victories are often the ones that don't need to be announced.